only validation that you will find as to the authenticity of these stories is contained in the websites of Washington Ghost Society and other paranormal society web pages, proving once more that there's a town's official history and a town's real history. Edmonds residents, like those of most historic small towns, love a good story of legends and lore. And who am I to disappoint? Poltergeists hide things. They walk the fourth dimension beside baying hounds and scrape kitchen chairs across the floor, waking anyone in the household who might have been asleep. They pitch, they throw, they toss books off the shelves of libraries at night and turn light switches on and off. Actually, it is this type of haunting that I want to alert you to in this first ghost story. The Main Street Poltergeist of Edmonds. You've seen him. You know you have. Out of the corner of your eye as you peruse the oldest of the downtown shops of Edmonds. But still you're not quite sure. Did something off to the right just move? Ever so slightly? Just enough to catch your attention? The air around you chills, and the hair on the back of your neck prickles at your sweater collar. The feeling that you should look over your shoulder seems silly. Surely you're overreacting to that foreboding feeling. You'd like to believe that you're alone as you survey wares and sales items in that quiet corner in the back of the shop. But are you alone? Probably not. The Main Street Poltergeist may have found you. Many shoppers have experienced his presence, and almost all shopkeepers along Main Street on either side of Edmonds Theater have suffered his pranks. Oh yes, he is a bit of a prankster, that one. Over the decades, shops have opened to celebratory grand openings and then silently gone dark. The twinkle lights flicker out as though after the holidays. You might have thought that rent increases caused those shops to close, but it might have just been the Main Street Poltergeist had just gotten a little bit too bold. Oh, imagine those long hours before closing. Tick-tock, tick-tock, doubting your sanity all the while. It begins each evening as the gloom of night crawls up the waterfront, dragging a cold blanket over the communities of Norma Beach and Meadowdale, and then into downtown. Shopkeepers shiver as darkness deepens into inky shades and the light from the lampposts flicker. Nightfall creeps eastward, and the Main Street Poltergeist begins pacing. And his patrolling has no bounds, whether it's bakeries, coffee stands, or gym shops. There's mischief to be made. How many shopkeepers fear stepping out into Main Street or Fifth Avenue after reconciling the till on those biting cold nights? Oh, it's not as though the headless horseman were on his black steed. It's not going to charge them as they scurry to their cars, but oh, they do scurry. Oh, the 4 business owners who have shared with me their stories of the Main Street Poltergeist, 3 of them have closed shop. Gone. Only one business, the bravest of all, is still located along Fifth Avenue and remains open to visitors on both sides of the grave. A while back, maybe 5 years ago, I wandered into a cupcake shop. Maybe you recall that cupcake shop along Main, where I often bantered with the bakery owner, an attractive woman named Glinda. As I entered the cold wind whirled leaves across my path and into the fragrant bakery. Looking up when she heard the bells on the door chime my arrival, she greeted me and asked what I was up to. Chasing Edmonds ghosts, if there are any, I replied. Her eyes widened. She blinked. She looked over her shoulder and into the kitchen area of her shop and then proceeded to wipe her palms down her apron. Go sit over there. I'll join you in a moment. She waved to one of the tables toward the back of the shop. After a short while, she slid into the chair facing mine, and this is the story she told. It all started immediately after she opened her cupcake shop. She noticed strange happenings and attributed it to fatigue. Working along in the wee hours each morning, she became frustrated over how many items she was misplacing, like pastry whisks, ingredients, even objects as large as the sugar canister. She admitted she would often muse out loud, why on earth would the Terrafazione be out here by the cash register and not next to the coffee roaster? Maybe those two things empowered the Main Street poltergeist. First, her thoughts stated out loud to be heard on the other side of the grave, and second, the acknowledgement of earth-bound luxuries that a spirit might yearn for. Like coffee, roasted in the great Italian tradition. Well, does the poltergeist wish to once more be earthbound to enjoy such delights as Italian coffee? Well, once Glenda mentioned aloud the misplaced object, it didn't take long before the activity picked up. The poltergeist had been acknowledged. She was no longer willing to be in her new business space alone during the long lulls between customers. So she hired her niece to help out. 2 against 1 and all of that. Glenda continued her story about how her niece cried out one morning startled. "Did you hear that?" Glenda told me that she had heard something, but hoped it would have been a noise from the business next door. She whispered to her niece, "What did it sound like to you?" "Like something being dragged across the basement floor. Could someone be down there?" And so it went. Odd happenings all times of day and night until the final straw. One morning at about 3 a.m., the 2 women were mixing batter for cupcakes. Glenda swore to me that she and her niece only turned their back for a moment when it happened. She stopped speaking and looked to see if her customers were eavesdropping. Really, no one was. Glenda pulled her chair in and leaned across the bistro table toward me. "We have a magnetic whiteboard on the wall in the kitchen. It lists the tasks we do every morning to open the bakery. One little round magnet is placed at each task that has to be completed. We slide them to the right as the tasks are done." Yes, go on," I coaxed. "Well, on this particular morning, as my niece started the coffee, and I was at the refrigerator retrieving the batter that had chilled overnight, those magnets flew off the board across the room. They clattered against the cupboard doors on the opposite side of the kitchen, 5 feet away, while each of us were a fair distance from that magnetic board, tending to our tasks." Oh, I burst out laughing, a guffaw of belief. "Surely not." Yes, it's true. They're actually very heavy, but the magnets flew off the board." Well, I didn't call her a liar, but still. She reiterated, "They didn't just slide down slowly as magnets might. And we didn't mistake their position and think they moved. They flew off the magnetic board." Ultimately, I believed her, as my collection of stories about the antics of the Main Street poltergeist grew. My next stop was a dusty little shop that sold rocks and gemstones. Maybe you've shopped there. I needed to buy amethyst. Amethyst warns off evil, you know. "Of course there are ghosts downtown, Chrissy," the shop clerk affirmed as I told her of my mission. "Poltergeists, maybe?" She thought for a moment. "Yes, actually." I relayed what I had learned from Glenda, the cupcake baker. "Surely, I believe it. The same thing here. Things that shouldn't move. Oh, I do want to hear this." And Chrissy's story began. "I hate being here alone in the winter. Waiting for closing is torturous. Tick-tock, tick-tock. I hear the clock, but it's as though time stands still. A feeling of unease comes over me. Goosebumps crawl up my arms. I'm afraid to look out. the corner of my eye for fear that there is someone standing right beside me, breathing. Then she began telling me of the crystal skull. It arrived from Mexico one year, having been packed in a crate as though it were a museum piece, straw and flannel protecting it during the long journey from the land of the Mayans. It weighs a good 30 pounds, she explained. See, it's right there. And she pointed. The Mayan skull peered down at us from the top of a curio cabinet that was easily 6 feet tall. The light from the multicolored strobe on the shelf next to it reflected a deep haze of cobalt blue, and then hellfire red, as the expression on the skull's lifeless face seemed to change with the mood of the strobe. At the end of the shift one evening, just a few nights ago, actually, she explained, I noticed that the skull was facing toward the doorway, as though it were watching the customers as they come in. How eerie. She nodded silently, her eyes moving to a point above my head. She was staring into the face of the skull, and it was staring back. I watched it in the reflection of the mirror on the wall behind the cash register. You sure have a lot of mirrors in your shop, she nodded. Mirrors ward off evil spirits. Does it work? I asked. No, not really. Spirits move about the store and odd things happen. We've had it. We're moving. And they did. They moved their gems and rocks, curios and collectibles to the safer side of the street. And I expect that the poltergeist activity continues in their former space because, you know, some things never die. The next story that I'm going to read is a bit shorter and is probably a little bit closer to home to anyone who has visited the Francis Anderson Center. The Ghost of Francis Anderson. Oh dear. Poor Miss Anderson, Edmonds' most famous, but also most restless ghost. Is it her realization of how beloved she is that keeps her from moving to the next station of eternal rest after such a distinguished career at Edmonds Grade School? If so, she has company. It is said the community center is haunted by any number of playful children ghosts and an old man tending the boiler room. Do we fascinate them as much as they fascinate us? It would seem so if the Washington State Ghost Society findings of 2006 are any indication. Why, long before reports of the wistful wandering of our celebrated schoolmarm of yesteryear and her spirited companion were even registered by the Washington State Ghost Society, the Edmonds Grade School was renamed Miss Anderson's honor and is now known as the Francis Anderson Center. The Ghost Society has even made this startling notation about the salmon-colored stucco building that sits at the pinnacle of Main Street. Employees and visitors to the Francis Anderson Center have reported haunting activity for years. Imagine, years. Well, why would this haunting activity plague the community center on Main Street with such persistence? Well, according to the Ghost Society, the voices of children have been heard late at night inside the classrooms of the former grade school. Children who cry out for new playmates to cross over to the other realm to visit them. There's haunting laughter and soft whispers. Are you there? And the mournful call, Mommy. But tisk, let's stay on the subject, shall we? The Washington Ghost Society acknowledges, quote, many experiences involve the ghost of Francis Anderson herself. It was a long, notable journey that resulted in Miss Anderson becoming headmaster of Edmonds Grade School. In 1917, she was hired to teach second grade at the stately building Following an illustrious academic career, first at the University of Washington and then the Whitewater State Normal School in Wisconsin. So, from 1917 until 1959, Miss Anderson walked the halls of the grade school. Over the decades, day in and day out, her measured steps were heard up and down the hallways, on the treads of the stairs, across the polished planks of the gymnasium. Ironic that, in tribute to her career, Miss Anderson was the first person to be named Edmonds School District's living legend, according to an account by Betty Lou Gang in the Snohomish Women's Legacy Report. Imagine being named a living legend 15 years after your death. More recently, in May 2006, the Washington State Ghost Society entered the Francis Anderson Center in order to conduct an investigation in response to these reports. The investigation report notes the obvious: the architecture of the dated three-story building clad in well-maintained stucco, reports received over the years of strange, unearthly occurrences, and the Ghost Society's formal request to the city of Edmonds to investigate. They set up the equipment that included digital cameras, camcorders, and voice recorders. Well, it was 9 p.m. on the night of the investigation, which took place in early spring. Having set up the recorders and dividing up into Team 1 and Team 2, the Ghost Society members waited in the dark, cavernous building, surrounded by the eerie silence that enveloped them. The stars twinkled in the springtime sky, and the moon moved across the heavens as the spirits began their restless pacing. What prompted the novice investigator to cry out nervously, "Is anybody there?" Oh, what a foolish and callow lad. Where is he now, I wonder? "Why aren't you finding me?" was the spirited tease that greeted him from the other side of the grave. Most certainly he shivered. Surely the hair on the back of his neck prickled. And at that moment, a black shadow darted across the hall as the members of Team 2 huddled together. Later, screwing up their bravery, Team 1 began shuffling in a pod toward the upper level of the school, and they made their way toward the door that noted the lofty title, Principal of the School. Look, was that a black shadow? Perhaps it was the ghost of Miss Anderson dashing back to her former office in an attempt to beat the Ghost Society members at their own game. Would Miss Anderson have made a dash toward her office? Frankly, I can't imagine. The reports of visitors to the community center note, though, seeing a specter wearing a long skirt, her hair in a sophisticated Gibson girl style, gliding up the stairs. That makes much more sense to me. Actually, I know teachers, now retired, who taught at the school. Not many of them felt the chill as they walked the halls or returning to their visit to the old classroom school on bright sunlit days, but a lot of people do feel that chill. People empathetic to the vibrations coming from the other side, why even in the daytime these empaths hear the echo of footsteps of the unseen Miss Anderson as she walks the long corridor. The melancholy sound bounces off the closed doors of classrooms left unheeded as winter approaches. And then there are the reports from those whose hearing is so keen, so acute, so perceptive. The empaths know to what I refer. It's the sound of chalk scraping across a blackboard, causing one to shudder and cringe. Maybe in years past, a teacher stalled her languid chalk script to greet Miss Anderson, now a ghost, but back then the school principal, as the noted educator entered the classroom. Why, I can see her now, Francis Anderson gliding along the stairwells at night, backlit at the second-story windows as cars slowly drive west on Main Street in the direction of the cold, murky waters of Puget Sound, and phantom-like ferries glide across the water, enshrouded in fog. Does anybody have any questions before I start the next story? Because if not, I'm going to go ahead and continue on to the house on 187th. That is the right street, isn't it? We have an interested party here in our realm today. And here is the story that goes with that experience that our co-listener imparted to me. As she listened, it puzzled her in the beginning. It's like that faint awareness that creeps over you as a faucet begins that restless, relentless dripping, and finally, in desperation, leads one to throw in the towel and succumb to the expense of an Edmonds plumber. Plink, plink, plink. Ooh, you wish you could wind back the time to your precognition of the annoying sound. And unfortunately, the resident on 187th Street Southwest couldn't wind back the time. It all began the very first night she moved in the 4-bedroom Rambler in the tidy 1960s era neighborhood, just a few left turns off 196. When Nancy, her Windermere realtor, found the listing, she reacted with outright glee. Imagine, home prices were skyrocketing in Edmonds, and this particular house was so cheap. Flawless, freshly painted, new carpeting. Determined to not let the opportunity slip away, she had nearly waived the inspection. I mean, really. A residence in Edmonds at Linwood prices. It was as though she was stealing from the sellers. Odd thing about the sellers. They had only owned the house for 5 months, October to February. That's when they moved out, in February. Well, who moves out in winter? The bluster, the whip of the wind coming down from Alaska. Imagine turning off the electricity. The house must have been deathly cold. So, why did the sellers move? She recalled asking Nancy. Nancy popped her gum before answering, first with a shrug. Who knows? A young couple, childless. That's what the listing agent told me. Looking back, she realized that should have been her moment of cross-check. That quick blink look skyward of Nancy's rang false now somehow. Had Nancy really asked about the previous owners? Did she truly know? Well, it was too late now as she cocked her head and took inventory of the creaks and the murmurs as she and the house got used to one another. Why, with $11,000 worth of closing costs and all the moving expenses being tapped out as she wasn't going anywhere. And so, as Pacific Standard Time ticked forward and the skies turned rosy pink, and that haunting indigo blue spread slowly across the sky, she settled in to think of the late summer garden she would plant under the 3 side-by-side bedroom windows at the back of the Rambler. That first night, she shook her head in despair, realizing her finances as she sat at the dining room table going over her new budget. One person in a 4-bedroom house, single, alone. No man to console her. Oh, the tragedy of it all. Mulling over her situation, she happened upon the solution of taking in roommates. It would ease her budget, allowing her leisurely lunches in downtown Edmonds, and also help her meet new friends. Yes, putting an ad on Craigslist seemed like a promising thing to do. It would be fun, meeting new people, maybe young people like herself who had moved to the Northwest following the tech industry. Things would be different in quaint, lovely Edmonds. She had, after all, put those distant and uptight Seattle Heights behind her. That Seattle freeze they all talk about. Well, for good reason, I might add. The next morning after breakfast, she grabbed her iPhone to take photos of her chic new abode. She uploaded them to Craigslist and waited for the email queries to come in. How simple is that? And so she moved about the house, congratulating herself for her stylish decor. Fresh new mid-century to match the style of the house, Picasso's, okay, fake Picasso's, a sunburst clock for the living room, angular club chairs, one in orange, one in complementary shade of green. The idea of plush throws to warm her guests once fall approached appealed to her. Maybe a soft orange throw for the green chair, an alternative green throw for the orange chair. Was that too over the top, she asked herself as she moved down the hall, snapping photos of the bedrooms. The master bedroom on her right with its dressing table and continental bath stretching the length of the 3 sleeping alcoves to the left. 1, 2, 3. Identically sized little bedrooms, each devoid of furniture. Even this might work perfectly in case her new roommates had their own furniture. How accommodating she would be. As long as the bright yellow kitchen and perfectly styled living room stayed tidy, she didn't care. She thought as she gently closed the door of the last bedroom, having taken pictures. Ooh, that's weird, she thought as she turned back to the now closed bedroom door. She laughed at herself. The sound of a bed creaking? Bed springs? Well, isn't that the funniest thing? How one's mind sorts out these little phenomena as they begin, placing them in the land of logic, when they shouldn't be there at all. But in fact, that was her first clue, that sense of foreboding that comes over one when something's not quite right. Well, anyway, she went along loading her photos and completing her chirpy Craigslist ad. Roommates, Edmonds, it cried. Well, somehow that's not the way things turned out as the month plodded by and she slipped her first mortgage payment into the mail slot at the mailbox at 4th and Main. From June and into July, one roommate potential after another passed up the opportunity to build a happy, gossipy little community of young professional women, with her thus easing her financial burdens. It's kind of cold in here on the north side of the house, they would say. Ooh, it's too clammy. I don't know, there's just something not right, or just plain silence, no reaction. No, I'll call you, I'm still looking. The funny thing was, she didn't feel completely alone in the house as the 3rd month approached. Now, not that that was a good thing, mind you. She would move through the house, checking the empty bedrooms, trying to reassure herself that she had something good going on, only to find hangers swaying when she would slide the closed doors open. Bedroom lights illuminated that she thought she had left off. Well, as the day-to-day pages on August's calendar were torn off and tossed into the recycle bin, leaves from the neighbors' trees began to blow into her yard. The Eggers, a retired couple, they mostly kept to themselves. The wife was a writer, she had learned from neighbors, a novelist to be exact. She had let her cat in one day to poke around their house, which it did. It moved about with classic curiosity. She let the cat back out to return to the Eggers' home. Oh, the cats didn't like something about the bedrooms of her home. It returned back to the neighbor's house, fur ruffled. It snarled, before backing away, that is. Ooh, snarled again before she herself frantically flipped the light switch in the hall, flooding the long, dark passage with light, and completely startling that poor cat, which snarled even louder and dashed full speed toward the bright openings of the living room. A groan, soft, barely audible as what she had heard, when she played the tapes over and over again in her mind. That is, a soft, barely audible groan mired over the snarl of the cat. Or maybe she had just imagined an overlay of wind moaning on that soggy day and had built that into her brain's playback mechanism. Regardless, that's the sound that played on her mind as she lay in bed in the dark that night. A long, mournful sound, not quite a cry. The sounds of crying and sobbing came later, like by the end of September. And that's when she had her first real conversation with Mrs. Egger. "You're moving, my dear? Why, you just got here. We haven't even formally met. I'm Mrs. Egger, by the way." Mrs. Egger stood watching her as she stuffed the flyers into the little plastic box on the for sale post that had been erected in front of her house. "How do you do?" she replied. "Yes, your husband. Rich, is it? He told me your name one day when I was petting your cat. My name is Dina." Yes," responded Mrs. Egger non-committally. "So, you don't like Edmonds?" "Oh, no, it's not that. I love Edmonds. The shops, walking along the water, all the restaurants, the bakeries." Mrs. Egger stared back, seeming to wait for an explanation of why someone would move out of the house only after 5 months. Well, what a weird pattern. Dina stammered. "I guess the house and I just don't agree, and I can't find roommates." Now she was blurting all of her business to a complete and total stranger. Mrs. Egger looked on. "Oh, it's just not as cozy as I thought it would be when I first moved in. In fact, it's almost foreboding." "Oh my goodness," was all that Mrs. Egger could manage as she placed her hand to her throat. "I'm too lonely, and I'm constantly imagining that I hear things." Oh, what a coincidence. The last owners moved out after an equally short while, Mrs. Egger noted, her voice trailing. "Well, who lived here before that, in the beginning?" "A nurse, actually, for many years." "Oh," Dina replied. "Did she work at Stevens Hospital?" "No, dear. She ran a nursing home business, taking care of the infirm. Right there, in your house." It's a true story, actually. This story, which I'll end with, is entitled "The Woman in White," and I read it last year at the Edmonds Cemetery, and it's taped on YouTube. And so for those of you who may have heard that story last year, I'm going to repeat myself, but it's a true and rather fascinating look at the Edmonds' early history. The Woman in White. Tales of Edmonds' wandering spirits find their way to me in the most unnerving manner sometimes, and I listen intently as each storyteller passes on their account of being startled or terrified by Edmonds' spirits. I quickly realize the extent to which residents find Edmonds' legends and lore captivating, even if it has to do with a long-ago death. This tale is about the specter of a young woman that takes shape in the thickening night fog along Olympic View Drive. I'm speaking, of course, of that precarious bend in the road. It is there, at that exact spot, where a shimmer of fog wraps its cloak around the shoulders of a willowy silhouette late at night. The specter stands beside the road, trembling and uncertain in her white gossamer gown. Surely the dear maiden must be chilled. Whoever she is, standing on the other side of the grave in the wavering weave of mist and shadow, her story deserves to be told. Let's presume, as some suggest, that she is Melissa Sweet, the pleasant but not entirely bright daughter of one of Edmonds' early settler families. It was Melissa who, after all, died under mysterious circumstances and lies at the Edmonds Memorial Cemetery. The year of her death, 1899. Ah, Melissa. She was a beautiful 16-year-old girl whose father was employed along the waterfront as a shake mill worker at Hatch and Bosner. There weren't many opportunities for the ivory-skinned young miss. She might have become a school teacher at the standby school at Brackett's feed store on 3rd and Edmonds, but the ever-cheerful Emily Fox held that position. Melissa had even inquired about the opportunity that presented itself at the sundry counter of the general store, selling ribbons and notions. But Mrs. Brackett had rejected that idea, reminding her husband that the young woman's dreary intellect might get in the way of good business. A placement more suitable for the sundries counter would be Miss Boldu, whose father was the sawmill foreman. The Bracketts simply knew the Boldus better. And so it was, the only outlet for Miss Sweet was to sing in the choir of the First Congregational Church, and so she did, every Sunday making a day of it. Her voice rang out sweet and clear, the mezzo-soprano notes signaling Miss Sweet's more mature, dusky nature. "Melissa, I want you to come home right after church. No tarrying," her father would undoubtedly have instructed as she left the family's shabby cabin on the last day of her life. "Yes, Papa," she would have most certainly agreed before adding, "I only need to stop at Miss Diner's to visit young Harry and Oscar and see about the nanny position." But did she visit Miss Tyner after that morning's sermon? We'll never know for sure, will we? What we do know is that she went missing, vanished, as it were. Well, the queerest thing was that what happened on the second day of her disappearance. It's her father's story, actually, how he found himself staring at the portrait of his late mother as he and his wife Eleanor awaited word of their missing daughter. He paced back and forth across the floorboards of his cabin, causing them to groan in protest. When he could speak of it, he told of his great distress when he stopped his pacing to stare in the photograph of his own mother and saw Melissa's face reflected in the glass frame, making it appear as though the two women were posing together. "Not possible," he protested to the constable, sorry later on that he had revealed the prophecy. Melissa's body was found one morning 3 days after her disappearance on the path leading through the forest north of Olympic View Drive. It was bitter and cold as the fog clawed its way up the high bank waterfront where the cedar mill belched kiln smoke, adding to the gray, drab day. Heavy dew lay like glass beads scattered onto the ground, and spiders scurried back and forth across Miss Sweet's curled, dead fingers. Purple they were and bruised, though that served as no clue as to the circumstances of her death. Miss Sweet's passing was almost certainly sudden. Photographs of her in sepia tones as she lay on the leaf-covered ground on the spindly trail that led to her father's cabin indicate a cracked skull. The death scene photographs focus on the look of Melissa's glazed, eyes wide open, a look of utter surprise. "I've never noticed what beautiful long eyelashes she had," readers of Edmonds Review observed as they stared into the eyes of death. One moment she's alive, the next moment she's dead. Or is she dead? Many asked, what was she doing out in the elements on that damp, foggy Sunday? Maybe she had a secret beau. Well, isn't that an innocent description? Beau. Maybe someone had enticed her into a rendezvous with, as it turns out, the Grim Reaper. Well, maybe she was alone, no sweetheart in her company at all, and the predictions, speculations, and gossip went on. Could she have been walking home, having completed her after-church errands, simply hastening a little bit too quickly to escape the damp cold that ironically now enfolds her? Was it that she lost her footing and her Boots slipped on the wet leaves, smashing her head against the jagged rock. Now that would be a sudden death. It is said that the difference between spirits and ghosts is that spirits are heaven-bound, willing to travel toward the universal truth that some call heaven and some call paradise. Ghosts, on the other hand, are not at all willing to submit to the startling and unexpected call of the Grim Reaper. Those apparitions tarry through the limbo of eternity, befuddled by such questions as, "What just happened?" or protestations of, "It can't be, I can't be dead." They wail, their voices often mistaken for the wind. Maybe in Miss Sweet's case it was, "Surely it can't all be over so soon." Many accidental deaths occurred in towns and cities all across America that year, and that was the findings of the Edmonds Court. Accidental. Whether or not, we'll never know. After all, Melissa Sweet wasn't a debutante, or a young woman whose death required much inquiry at all. Case closed. And maybe that is what haunts the soul of the ghost that takes shape on the shrouded nights when the fog horns out on Puget Sound sob. Quite possibly, there is more to the death of Miss Melissa Sweet than meets the eye. So, as the headlights of drivers leaving Edmonds flash on the muted vision of a silhouette whose bustle and petticoat reveal a period in our history, but not conclusive reasons for a young woman's death, we should wonder what causes her to linger. Does Miss Sweet stand there along the much-traveled Olympic View Drive, befuddled as to why she so abruptly left the land of the living? Perhaps. But if you should encounter her spirit lost in the fog on these clammy still nights of late autumn, you should ask her why she haunts that stretch of Olympic View Drive, or an even more assured way to learn why she cannot move on to the next station of death would be to ask her during your visit to her gravesite, Block 3, Lot 14 at Edmonds Memorial Cemetery. She's waiting for you there now.